Well, welcome. Hello. Come in. Pull up a chair. Pour yourself a glass of neat vodka. Make yourself at home. Thank you for joining me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for the latest in the IEA's In Conversation series, where I sit down, usually virtually, but increasingly now face to face, with a politician, a newsmaker, a thinker, and talk to them a bit about their life, their career, and what they make about the world around us today. And before I introduce today's very special guest, let me get the housekeeping, the boring stuff, out of the way. We're broadcasting this discussion on two platforms, live, Zoom and on YouTube. If you're on the Zoom side of it and you want to put a question to our guest this evening, please put that in the Q&A function, not in the chat box, the Q&A function. I've got an iPad here and I'll be looking at the Q&A function, and drop them in whenever anything pops into your mind. You don't have to wait until I've begun with the opening questions. If you're on the YouTube side, I'm going to do the best I can to keep up with that on my mobile phone. So sprinkle some questions there and I'll do my very best to put some of those questions as well. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things. The future of liberalism, the past of liberalism, the state of the parties, Brexit, wokery, the state of individual freedom in Britain. So anything in those sort of areas or beyond, put your questions in the chat. So that's out of the way. Now let me introduce tonight's guest, very good friend of mine and of freedom in general. Delighted to be joined by Jeremy Browne. Jeremy, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm hugely flattered to be here. I am. That sounds insincere. It's a bad start.
Yeah, well, you are
more than 6 years since I've been a politician, so it's extremely kind of you to.
Well, let me run through your crime sheet then, your political crime sheet. You are, of course, the former Liberal Democrat MP for Taunton Deane. You represented the constituency between 2005 and 2015. You served as Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesman from 2007, and then during the coalition government you had ministerial office. You were part of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office team as Minister of State for Southeast Asia, the Far East and the Pacific, and you were also at the Home Office as Minister of State for Crime Prevention. After leaving Parliament in 2015, you spent 3 years as Special Representative for the City of London Corporation in the EU, leading efforts to boost the city's presence in Brussels, and after that you went on to become International Business Ambassador for Aberdeen Standard Investments. So you're one of those people who managed to escape the public sector side of life and get into the private sector side of life. Really interesting career to date. Let me take you back to, you say it's 6 years since you've been a politician. Let me take you back to when you were a politician and serving in the Liberal Democrats. Tell us a little about the coalition government years. Was this the highlight of the peak? Was that peak Lib Dem, those years? And was it a good, sensible and liberal government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition?
Well, first, unequivocally, yes, it was peak Lib Dem. I mean, political parties don't exist solely in order to win votes and win power. They can influence the direction of public discourse and government and policy making from the outside, but primarily they are vehicles for winning and exercising power and delivering ideas. I think otherwise you're slightly fraudulent. If you go to the electorate and you say, vote for me, I want to do X, Y and Z, and then when you have an opportunity to do X, Y and Z, or maybe just X and Y, you say, oh, well, actually, I didn't actually really have my heart in doing that at all. I just wanted to be a member of Parliament and criticise other people who try and put their policies into effect. So it's the only time the Liberal Democrats have been in government since the Second World War. We won more seats in 2005 than we did in 2010. But in 2010 to 2015, we governed our country, and we should be very proud of that still. And I think it wasn't a flawless government, which government is, but I think it stands up pretty well. I thought it stood up pretty well at the time, and I think it stands up pretty well in retrospect as well.
But the interesting thing was the unusual nature of having a coalition government. I mean, over our lifetimes, we've had all sorts of confidence and supply arrangements. The Liberal Party in the mid-1970s giving support to Callaghan's minority Labour government. Of course, we had the DUP giving confidence and supply, as it was called, to Theresa May's government. But full-blown coalition has been very, very unusual. And it didn't serve the Liberal Democrats' electoral interests particularly well, did it? I mean, in fact, you didn't say this about the Liberal Democrat Party, but the sort of vote for us were a bit of a sort of protest vote. Oh heck, now we're in government, we've got to decide things, and lo and behold, the Liberal Democrat support plummeted really over the course of the coalition, and the party was eviscerated.
It was a
in the
crash
succeeding
course.
election.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think there is something noble in politics in serving the interests of your country, and I think we did that. I don't think it was inevitable that it would serve the Lib Dems as badly as it did in terms of number of seats we won at the subsequent election. But it was a crash course in maturity for the party, and I think, and a crash course in some ways in maturity for our electoral coalition. And that was difficult. I remember talking to not in my constituency, talking to a person on the doorstep who said, you know, I've voted for you for 25 years and I'm absolutely disgusted, I'm never voting for you again. And I said, but after all that time waiting, we finally got in, we're in government. She said, well, I don't want that, I'm voting for the Greens. You know, and that was, as you say, that is a difficulty for a party that had a protest element in its sort of voter composition. But I thought it was an opportunity for us to make the transition from being a party of opposition and protest to being a party of government. And I thought we stuck the course well during the 5 years. But if I'm honest, I think in the end we weren't willing psychologically to make that transition, and the party was relieved to be out of government by 2015. And I think that is sad, and I think it was a missed opportunity, and you know, I think the last 6 years have shown that it's a missed opportunity.
So let's look at the last 6 years. I mean, not much has happened in politics since you
I know, I feel like it's only 3 general elections.
Three general elections.
In my day, you tend to get a 5-year run if you won a general election. My successor has won more general elections in my seat than me, and
President Trump's been and gone. The Brexit referendum.
I know.
It's been. What would you say have been the highlights and lowlights for you in politics since you left Parliament?
Well, I'm not sure that there have been that many very obvious highlights. And we're going to talk about Brexit. I think the low light is I think Parliament has not covered itself in glory at all. I personally felt that the whole the sort of latter stage of the John Bercow era was a extremely bleak time for Parliament, and the disconnect between the interests and priorities of parliamentarians and those of the wider public was stark to me, standing on the outside. And it's been a difficult time for politicians. It's a difficult job in many ways being an MP, and it must be even harder now with the COVID restrictions and everything else. But you know, it's been obviously a pretty rocky time for politics. Theresa May was my Secretary of State when I was a Home Office Minister, so I saw her, you know, up close in the department. I was surprised that so many Conservatives thought that she had the obvious leadership qualities to be Prime Minister in a time of great difficulty and transition. And I don't think, you know, let's be kind about it, I don't think her premiership will go down as you know, being in the top 5 or top 10 of all time. So that was a difficult time. I think we looked weak as a country. I think we looked like we lacked direction. And there are problems I have at the moment. I think there are big, fundamental, unresolved questions around reform of public services, affordability of social care. The state is ballooning to a size which is much too big and unsustainable. I think we've got pretty much 100% GDP to debt ratio. Now, everyone understands the exceptional circumstances, but I haven't heard many proposals for reining in. I mean, the only proposal I've heard for cutting government spending is defunding the police, which I imagine even the IEA thinks is probably pushing it. Yeah,
Black Lives Matter are a bit too Thatcherite for us on that one. Yeah.
I mean, the whole time I was in government, you know, the Labour Party never offered, as I recall, a single proposal for making the state more cost effective. The left have now come up with one, which is to abolish the police force.
Yeah, well,
which would save quite a lot of money, but I fear it would have other unintended consequences.
Some unintended consequences, you'd think. Okay, let's roll back to let's delve into Brexit then somewhat. You were a kind of you were a Remainer, I think, but not an impassioned one.
I was radicalised by this process. The biggest change for me since I was a Member of Parliament is I have had my outlook changed by Brexit. I was nervous before the vote even took place. I felt that the Remain side of their argument was allowed to have their thumb on the scales, because I thought this was a genuine exercise. I thought it was, it's perfectly reasonable in a free, open society that people, one member or one person, one vote, should be able to decide the destiny of their own country. And whether we are a member of a supranational institution or not seems like a reasonable question to put to a referendum to me. The Conservatives had stood at the general election in 2015 saying if we win an overall majority, we will have a referendum on this question. They did win an overall majority. They kept their promise. Nothing wrong with politicians and governments keeping their promises.
Rare but welcome.
Parliament spent months looking at it in detail, what the franchise would be, what the question would be. It was passed with a massive majority in the House of Commons to hold the referendum. And then, before polling day, I got nervous. The government spending millions and millions of pounds on a leaflet promoting the Remain side of the argument when the equivalent funding wasn't made available to the Leave side felt like a distortion to me. The use of the civil service in partisan arguments to see the, Chancellor of the Exchequer and key member of the Remain campaign citing Treasury work to make his political case. We don't generally have Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer citing Treasury's research to discredit Labour's manifesto in a general election. So I thought, and then of course there was a massive, imbalance in the support. I mean, I think, for example, there are more than 100 universities in the country. I think every single one supported Remain. Nearly all businesses supported Remain, and on it went. So it felt like a one person, one vote, but as I say, with a hand or a thumb on the Remain side of the scales. But nevertheless,
I mean, remarkable. Remain didn't prevail.
Well, I think in part because they had an extraordinarily bad campaign. I thought the campaign deserved to lose, and I wasn't, entirely sold on one side or the other. I wasn't of the view that that Remain or Leave should definitely win. I thought there were some quite strong arguments for leaving the EU and some quite bad arguments, and some quite strong arguments for remaining in, some quite bad arguments as well. So I thought about it quite long and hard. I felt I had a duty as a citizen to cast my vote. It's clearly an important election. And I voted Remain in the end, not for the reasons that are generally given, for a whole host of reasons. But I didn't do it with a sort of zealotry. And as soon as I heard the result, I thought that it should be accepted and the due process should take place. And what really shocked me, and continues to shock me now, is I just assumed that was a given, that the result would be put into effect. And it wasn't a given. And that was a revelation to me. And it has changed my view and attitude towards how people in positions of authority exercise their power. Because for me, the government derives its authority from the people. It serves the people, not the other way around. And yet a lot of people in positions of power seem to think that they no longer derive their authority and power from the electorate as a whole. They were there to
I get it. So, but I just want to be. So you genuinely thought that once it was 52-48, and all right, some lunatics thought, has there been, Russian engagement, or has anybody, foreign? But if you accepted that the election was free and fair, which the overwhelming bulk of, I think, people do,
I mean, so much as it wasn't,
it was the stacked to Remain.
Stacked on the Remain side. Yeah.
But then you do obviously have the question of what does Leave mean, right? So that did seem to me open to interpretation. It wasn't absolutely explicit, I think, in the question that you had to leave the single market and the customs union. I mean, to my mind, that was rather strongly implied. It would be a bit odd to remain in the European Union, to leave the European Union, but to remain in the single market and the customs union. But that was implied. You could have put a case, okay, well, we're going to leave the European Union, but we're going to rejoin EFTA or EEA, for example.
Yeah.
So the nature of Leave wasn't particularly clear. The nature of Remain would have been clear. Here is Cameron's deal. Supposed renegotiation. I mean, almost no difference to our present membership.
Say the nature of Remain, it'd be clear. The European Union is still committed to ever closer union. It's a constantly evolving process. So I'm not sure that is true. Who can say with certainty what the EU will look like in 20, 30, 40 years' time? But it was clearer, arguably, than Leave. But for me, leave meant what would be understood by the average passenger on the Barnsley omnibus as leaving an institution, not what a clever lawyer who can argue that up is down and left is right, if you gave him enough money and enough time, could argue is leaving an institution.
Yep.
And if we are still subject to EU rules and regulations, we are still making substantial financial contributions to the EU. I mean, I think the average person would have not recognised that as a faithful delivery of the mandate of the referendum. And so for me, I think there was a logic in getting to somewhere pretty close to where we've got to.
And why do you think that process was so agonising? I mean, you're suggesting that the scales fell from your eyes. Actually, the political establishment, which you had assumed for all of its faults, you assumed would fall in behind a popular mandate. It actually seemed not only were these powerful forces lined up for Remain going into the referendum, fair enough.
Fair enough. No, everyone could. It was a national debate.
But afterwards, there did seem to be a pretty concerted effort to effectively frustrate or set aside the result, and that surprised you.
There was, and it was. It took. I mean, there were a whole load of arguments which were, and to say they were spurious, I think is kind. I mean, I was shocked by them. I mean, there were arguments made, for example, that older people's votes were somehow less valid than younger people's votes. That lots of decades of accumulated wisdom made you less qualified to vote than people who had the absence of that experience. After all, the people who had the greatest exposures to the EU appeared to be the least enthusiastic about continuing to be a member of it. There was arguments made that less well-educated people, somehow their votes were less valid than others, that people who didn't live in London and the southeast, their votes were somehow less valid, that there should have been the referendum shouldn't count because it was only advisory, even though everybody understood beforehand that it would be, in fact, David Cameron had promised us that it would be put into effect. That it should have been a 2/3 majority. I mean, on and on it went. And then, there were very, very senior people, previous ministers at the highest level of government, very senior civil servants who had served in, sensitive positions to do with our national interest abroad, who were going to Brussels and having meetings with the EU about how they could frustrate the British government's negotiating position. And then the British government's negotiating position under Theresa May built in so many concessions and watered down Brexit to such an extent that I felt that it was questionable whether it had really delivered the mandate properly as well. So the whole way through, and then John Bercow in Parliament, in my view, I may watch the Wimbledon finals this weekend. I want that to be a proper contest to determine the best tennis player. I don't want the umpire to be clearly favouring one player over the other. And Bercow, who has talents, it's a great shame in many ways, I think, what has happened to him, but he was so clearly and brazenly supporting one side over the other. It was like the umpire got down from the chair and was volleying home winners. And I was shocked by it. Maybe I maybe I was just naive, but I came to the view that actually living in a democracy is more important than living in the European Union. And that actually, regardless of how I or others had voted in the referendum, the delivery of the mandate of the referendum was crucial to trust in our politics and our institutions for generations to come.
I share your surprise here, but I'm kind of about the vehemence of the ongoing Remain campaign after the referendum, because generally speaking, we've had over our lifetimes, you sort of fight hammer and tongs. You say that everything's at stake. This is the most important election or referendum for a generation, forever, and then within 12 hours of the votes being counted, everybody sort of moved on.
There have been 10 major votes in my adult lifetime, 8 general elections and 2 UK-wide referendums. And I have voted for the winning proposition on the ballot paper twice, and I accepted the results in the other 8. I think you have to. Otherwise, the system breaks down. And what's more, it is perfectly possible. I mean, I voted for Remain in the end because of a combination of some slightly sentimental reasons. I actually am quite attracted to the sort of vision of the founding fathers. I think it's a really big visionary, one of the biggest, most visionary, most idealistic things that have ever happened in politics. The foundation of the European Union, the idea of putting the 2 wars behind our continent and trying to make sure that didn't happen again. The sort of brotherhood of man argument. It's amazing the Remain side didn't deploy any of that sentiment. I accept that the reality of the EU is often quite distant from idealism, but nevertheless, I think the idealism is a component part. And out of the realpolitik reason for voting Remain, I think the EU is a big, powerful institution on our continent, and I think it's better with Britain being a member of it, rather than it being left to the French and the Germans to run it without Britain. I think it's better for Britain. I actually think it's better for the EU as well, Britain being a member. And many people across countries in the EU have said exactly that to me. So I voted for Remain for a number of reasons, some of them realpolitik, some of them a bit more sentimental. But I've never, ever thought that Britain could not function properly outside.
Well, this is
EU.
what
and all of these sort of defeatist arguments that we were somehow so inadequate and so hopeless as a country that we couldn't stand on our own feet.
This is what I wanted.
Were extraordinary.
This is what I wanted you to help me explore about the reaction to the disappointed Remainers. Rose Poyser asks in the chat, could you elaborate on what you mean by the difference between parliamentarians and the public in the latter stage of the J. Bercow era? What I'm trying to get my head round is really why anybody on either side cared as much. Right, I mean, I'm trying to get. I can totally understand your point of view.
Yeah, for me, the sun rose in the morning either way.
Yes,
really,
I mean, I can understand. I can understand the case for remaining in the European Union. A good number of IEA staff were in favour of remaining in the European Union. It split the IEA. It didn't seem to me to be an absolute black and white matter. What I couldn't understand was people believing that it was so absolutely fundamental to the existential nature of the United Kingdom that every effort must be made to reverse the decision. I can't get into that mindset.
I think it wasn't I mean, this argument that Britain is incapable of managing its own affairs outside the EU and that everything good about our country has been conferred upon us by the EU seemed to me a truly absurd argument. And I mean, there are only 3 countries in the world outside the EU with bigger economies than ours, the Americans, Chinese and the Japanese. And do people really think that those are the only 3 countries in the world
that are viable?
Capable of, that are viable. They're capable of ordering their own affairs without being a supranational institution.
So I'm with you.
With Bulgaria.
Why were the likes of Ed Davey and others that this is the cross I'm going to die on? Why?
I think it became a manifestation almost of a sort of extension of identity politics, that it demonstrated that you were a liberal-minded internationalist person who, saw the potential benefits of, interaction with. I mean, I assume, but I mean, for me, I think there are some people who felt a greater allegiance to the European Union as an institution they did to their own country. But probably,
that's not necessarily horrific.
I'm not perfectly. If they wish to do that, that's up to them. But I think it became more than that. I think people somehow equated in their mind that to be in favour of Remain and to try and overturn the referendum result marked you out as a good person. And I'd go a bit further, a bit of snobbery in there. A civilised person, an educated person, a reflective person, an international person who, and I can see, and there are some advantages. I mean, the advantages remaining, like the flip side of being able to have a greater control of your own immigration policy is restrictions on the ability of your own citizens to work, in a bar in Ibiza or a ski instructor in Val d'Isère or whatever it might be. So for people who, and that maybe did create a bit of a sort of social class divide, because people who are from parts of the country and from social backgrounds where they're unlikely to be a ski instructor in Val d'Isère perhaps feel less of a sense of loss of that being removed from them than people
So you're sort of saying that
thought that was a possibility.
the Continuity Remain campaign was, in essence, a monumental virtue signal, rather than an empirical analysis of the supposed benefits of still remaining in the EU.
I think the fervour behind it had that element. Look, I mean, there are. I think at the time there were arguments to remain in the EU, and there were arguments to leave the EU. For me, it wasn't completely black and white, and many of those arguments to remain, which is how I voted myself, remain valid.
Yeah.
5 years later. I mean, if you think that an argument for being in the EU is that it is a fantastic freedom for British citizens to be able to go and live and work wherever they want to in the European Union, that remains a compelling reason to be in the European Union. If you think that trumps all other considerations, then you can still feel very strongly about that. And particularly, I imagine, for people who are married to somebody from another country and they're in the EU and their children are dual nationals. I mean, I can see it has an emotionally charged element in that scenario as well. But so I'm not saying there aren't valid reasons being the EU, and that a lot of those reasons people can't still hold even if they've been on the losing side. Yeah. But I do think that some of them got so magnified in people's minds that they thought that overturning the referendum result and showing contempt for the people who'd voted the other way for them was somehow a morally virtuous path to go down. Mm-hmm. And I was very uncomfortable with that. The idea that disregarding democracy and overturning election results makes you morally superior and virtuous to the people who take it in and accept it, as I and virtually everybody in politics has had to do, is you win some, you lose, and that's life, isn't it? Really, you don't always get what you want, and it's extraordinary to see people behaving as if they have some sort of God-given right to always be on the winning side.
Let me just drill down a bit into the Liberal Democrats as a party now. Then I see Jordan Grover asks on the chat: do the Liberal Democrats still have a libertarian element? Back in the glory days when I was the head of the press office and you've just been elected Member of Parliament for Taunton Deane, the high watermark of the Liberal Democrats, right?
Why was that?
Right. There was the Orange Book phenomenon. I think that actually paved the way to make a coalition government with the Conservatives possible rather than unlikely.
Not just the personnel, but the intellectual heavy lifting that went behind it.
What do you make of what has become of the Liberal Democrats since, I guess, the referendum? Or you can certainly say at the end of the coalition, they obviously get destroyed in the general election of 2015. Don't do much better in 2017, 2019. It's been a pretty appalling state of affairs. And what are they for now? What were they ever for, really?
Well, I don't want to kick the party. I was hugely honoured to be a Liberal Democrat MP for 10 years. I was very honoured to serving government as a Liberal Democrat MP. And I am hugely loyal still to my local party, who did a huge amount to get me elected. But I am both a Liberal and a Democrat. And I sometimes struggle to see how the Liberal Democrats encourage me as both a Liberal and a Democrat to vote for them. Certainly, we've just spent the last quarter of an hour talking about the Democrat side of the equation. But even on the Liberal side of the equation, there are people in the Lib Dems who have some good instincts, in my view. But the whole Orange Book side of the party has pretty much, vaporised, with one or two exceptions. And Ed Davey, I think, has some quite good instincts, particularly around economic liberalism. But does the party unequivocally stand for freedom, if you like? No, not really. I mean, not just in personal choice, but I think, if you take sort of touchstone issues around sensitive subjects at the moment, are the Lib Dems out in front, saying, unequivocally, we must be a liberal society. Not that I see. In fact, quite often, the Lib Dems went into the last general election in 2019. Woke and revoke was the dual-pronged strategy. I don't think you need to be an MP in the west of England for 10 years to think that is unlikely to take
a minority sport.
Well, you need in those seats to be 45% plus to be winning those seats, and those, to be kind, were not at that level of support.
Yeah.
And I have a problem with the woke side as well as the revoke side. For me, identity politics is hugely damaging and corrosive and divisive, and ought to be treated with extreme caution. And the party has embraced many aspects of it, and they're not alone in this. So have loads of FTSE 100 businesses. So have the Conservatives to some extent. Labour almost unequivocally, which is why they have some of the problems with their own voter base. So but have the Lib Dems? There's this sort of mass groupthink going on at the moment, and a sense of coercion that everybody must conform to the new mantras and must get their wording exactly right, and must believe in the opposite of what you used to believe in, and you must do it with great fervour, and even subconsciously you must believe in things, no longer just allowed to believe in them consciously. And for me, a Liberal Party would be saying, whoa, wait a second, the ability for an individual to be able to think freely for him or herself, to be able to speak out freely, to be able to challenge orthodoxy, to resist groupthink, those are all very, very important in a liberal society. And I don't particularly, to be fair on the Lib Dems, I don't hear it much from even the Conservatives. Yeah. But this is an opportunity for the Lib Dems. For me, the proposition that we are having put in front of us now is that we are divided by our race, our sex, our sexual orientation, that I can never unequivocally and without reservation be a friend of a black person, because our relationship must be defined by the colour of our skin, and that I must have a role that is historically oppressive, and I must be regarding my oppressive instincts towards this other person, and he or she must be a victim in some way, and whether it's consciously or unconsciously or both, I must go to re-education classes because for me, that doesn't sound like a healthy state of affairs. And the fact that it's been embraced so much that you hear, every business, not every, but large numbers of businesses and high street names have embraced this with such zeal. It feels to me that if there is a place in politics for somebody to say, wait a second,
okay, but let's tease out, what do you put this down to? I agree with everything you've said. I definitely, wouldn't say there is no problem in the United Kingdom with racism. There clearly is. I've always struggled a bit with trying to quite understand what institutional racism means, but I think you could make some accusations, certainly historically, that the police force was, if you look at deaths in custody, it happens a lot more to black people. I think there has been homophobia, and there are problems here, but they are considerably less than they were when I was a boy. It seems to be a war we've been winning. If you're on the, let's all rub along together, whether we're men, women, gay, straight, black, white. Why has this?
Well, I feel this a bit.
Why has race suddenly become this defining, or identity of any sort, become the defining issue?
I went to Sainsbury's, and it's festooned with pride flags. That's their call. Mm-hmm. But I did feel a bit that they've come to the celebrationary after party without having done the heavy lifting. Now, if Sainsbury's had done that in the 60s when homosexuality was illegal, or in the 80s when disproportionately large numbers of gay men were dying of AIDS, that would have been quite a statement. But
then
I'm not sure what they are saying now, apart from the place that I just thought did bread and milk is now there to tell me what I should believe in. Now, as it happened, I was a member of Parliament for 10 years, and I voted consistently for what you might think was gay-friendly legislation. I voted in favour of gay marriage. So I don't actually feel a need to be lectured by Sainsbury's, particularly on this issue. But I think it's quite interesting that they feel that it's their place to deliver the lecture.
And hang on, but why is this happening, do you think? You were suggesting that the Liberal Democrat proposition of which you elegantly put as woke and revoke was not a great winner, might have been passionately felt by a very small section.
I don't think it was Liberal or Democratic or electorally.
Yeah, none of those things. So why have Sainsbury's stumbled across the conclusion that Sainsbury's in Taunton or in London or wherever, this is a great marketing plan, that putting pride flags everywhere is going to make people feel much more comfortable about buying our bread and milk? Where has this come from? I'm not trying to pick on Sainsbury's in particular.
No, but it's quite interesting
because
they're big, because they're a store that. And what are they saying? Are they morally superior to Tesco's? Are people who go to Tesco's morally inferior to their
Tesco's have presumably got the same things up.
I don't know. But it's why stop there? I mean, are they only? I'd be interested to see the list of what societal causes they are interested in promoting. I mean, for example, I think it. I'm trying to think of I think by and large, it is good for children to be brought up by two parents rather. I'm sure there are lots of children who are happily brought up by one parent, and there are lots of children who are badly brought up by two parents. So that's an obvious caveat.
Yep. But as a rule of thumb.
There is a lot of, I think, pretty compelling evidence that young men who are brought up without a father can suffer disadvantages that some greater guidance that a father figure might provide it could be helpful. So I don't know, Sainsbury's going to campaign on promoting the nuclear family. I mean, I'm not particularly asking them to. I'm just interested at what point they stop thinking that it was their role to sell me bread and milk and start their role to educate me into what I should. I suppose my bottom line is, in that way I'm quite a sort of curmudgeonly liberal. I basically don't want to be told by other people or institutions what I should think or what I should say the whole time. And I don't want to be told that I should or shouldn't eat a double decker particularly, or what my views are on nuclear families or on gay marriage or something else. We can have interesting discussions about all of those subjects, but what I don't want to be is lectured by people or institutions. And that, in a way, my liberalism in that way is quite a sort of is quite a sort of leave me alone liberalism. Sure. It's a sort of ability of people to live their lives without being bossed around the whole time.
And why? But still, I mean, obviously you're not answerable for Sainsbury's Pride Month campaign, but why is this happening? This is what I can't really understand. I mean, maybe you and I, as curmudgeonly liberals, are just now a vanishingly small part of the electorate, and in fact, people are flocking in their thousands to buy bread and milk from Sainsbury's because of the elegantly arranged pride flags over the various supermarket aisles. But that doesn't ring true to me. So why do you think corporate culture, political culture, is going down this direction when there doesn't, if you like, appear to be a market for it? I mean, as a broad supermarket. What on earth?
It's like all the
going
Volkswagen car ads at the football are all rainbow coloured and say how low carbon emission their cars are. Right. Which is interesting, because that wouldn't have been the core proposition for a German high-speed car
30 years ago. Yeah.
No, it is strange. Ben and Jerry's think that they don't. Just making very sweet ice cream with strange flavours isn't their job. Their job is to tell people what to believe, whether they eat their ice cream or not. And of course, you could say it doesn't really matter with Ben and Jerry's. It matters more with the big tech firms. Yeah. And I'll give you. I mean, we go back to. I think small L liberals lost their way with Donald Trump. You don't have to. It's a bit like accepting the result of, as I say, the 10 elections I've voted in, the big elections. I've been on the losing side 8 times. you can accept the result with good grace. I think it's important. You don't have to be a Donald Trump supporter to think that it is a bit unnerving that some politicians are allowed to communicate using big social media platforms and others are not. Yeah.
I know, I can understand that on the social media side where they're more directly plugged in. But could you not, let me try and play a bit of devil's advocate here. Couldn't you argue that sort of Sainsbury's and Ben and Jerry's or whoever else are being good corporate citizens? Actually, perhaps we should get back into a situation in which companies give party political donations. I mean, that sort of was dried up, really. I mean, but I think back in the day, I think I've got it right, British Airways were a donor to the Conservative Party. Yeah. I mean, that would be considered absolutely...
Not many gave money to the Labour Party in Michael Foot's era.
No, probably not many. But obviously, the trade unions, you could argue, are a big part of civil society.
Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan both gave
a lot to the Remain campaign. So, I mean, sort of... Why not? Why can't Ben and Jerry's say we're corporate citizens, we give a lot of money to Greenpeace, we think you should vote Labour or whoever it is?
I'm not saying, I don't think there should be a law about how Sainsbury's decorate their stores. Entirely up to Sainsbury's and its shareholders and its chief executive. I just think that the process is quite interesting, that they seem to not be content with trying to sell me high quality groceries. Yeah. In a nice environment at a price I want to pay. That doesn't, which I would have thought is what they existed.
It's pretty much their core proposition.
I thought they seem to feel that they also have another aim, which is to tell me what I should believe.
Yeah.
And what social attitudes I should adopt. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed to do that. Of course they should be allowed to. I just think it's quite an interesting process that we're undergoing. And I think what sort of unsettles me a bit about it is, well, lots of things unsettle me about it is that the arguments all come from one direction. And there's a terrible sort of conformity and group thing. As I say, you put 100 university vice chancellors in 100 separate rooms. I suppose it's possible they all come up with exactly the same answer to the question. But these are institutions that are meant to promote free thought and
diversity
and the exploration of ideas.
Yeah.
And yet they all seem to march in step with one another. And anyone who strikes a discordant note is instantly sort of banished. Right. And yet look about great historically heroic figures. I think Galileo or Charles Darwin, people
stood out against the
and so you said, I know you all think this, and it's a great heresy to think otherwise, but I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I don't agree. I mean, literally a heresy, and both of their cases, literally a heresy. What would we do now? I suppose they'd be cancelled. They certainly wouldn't be allowed to go and lecture at Oxford University. And is that so? I think if you're a liberal with a small L or a Liberal Democrat, are you comfortable with a society which increasingly makes less space for whoever the Galileos and Charles Darwins are of today? And I think the answer should unequivocally be no.
So
there should be an encouragement of free thought and diverse thinking, and not only should people not be corralled into correct think, but they should be left alone, and they shouldn't be assumed that that their relationship with others and things is completely preordained by their race or whatever else it might be.
So what do you make, and let me go on to another area, both you and I are keen followers of football. What do you make of the England team, and not just the England team, football teams in England prior to that, taking the knee? Let me just, my view is I find it all a bit confusing. On the one hand, clearly I agree with the statement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, it seems to me to be so obviously the case it's true. I'm also conscious that historically, probably now as well, less so in England than in some other territories, there is racism in football or on the terraces. Nothing like as bad as it was in the 1980s. So I'm quite keen that football sort of takes a long hard look at itself and asks itself, is it racially biased in any way, and sort of tries to address that. There's been a kick-out racism campaign on a much more softly thing. But
and there are things like conspicuously few black managers. And,
yes, for example, although many black players, of course. Now,
yeah.
It would be
disproportionately large
disproportionately
number, relative to the population.
But
your QPR supporter, Les Ferdinand's, not only historically important role in our club, but current role in our club.
Was to stop them taking the knee. So, but I'm trying to. What confused me was watching this. I mean, I watch an obscene amount of football. But the commentator would always say on either channel, I think Sky, BBC or ITV, and the players here sending a very important message and a very clear message. It might be important, but it's not clear to me what the message is. Is it clear to you what the message is? I mean, are they supporting Black Lives Matter and defunding the police? As I say, a policy. I'm interested in intellectually discussing the private.
They had Black Lives Matter written on their shirts rather than their names.
How is this not? I thought politics in football was banned by UEFA. There was a controversy about whether you could wear the poppy.
Well, I'm going to say. Well, I'm going to say something from the other side a bit. Then from the other side, I'm uneasy about poppy coercion as well. I think when you have foreign correspondents on BBC News who are broadcasting live from the other side of the world, it's always like a miracle. Where did they get this poppy? I mean, presumably being sent, and the BBC, and they're appearing on these. And there's a race. You can't wait till the beginning of November. You've got to be stuck on every sort of football pundit mid-October onwards, regardless of where they are in the world or their nationality, and embroidered into football shirts. And I think that.
But in
fairness, I think it's
Jeremy,
laudable. You could argue. I would argue that the poppy campaign is not a political campaign, but I think, nevertheless, I venerate the role our service.
But as far as I'm aware, the Royal British Legion doesn't have a policy platform.
And there's not. Indeed, it doesn't, or at least it does. It's extremely benign. But all I'm saying is, I think there is a sort of a slightly conformist, coercive element, an informally coercive element, and a conformist element in wearing poppies, particularly broadcasters. I only say that as a sort of correction because that would be seen as more in a case that you might imagine, the sort of Nigel Farage, if you like. But I think the same with the Black Lives Matter campaign. I am strongly opposed to the nearly all the political objectives of Black Lives Matter. And I think the idea that you can adopt their literally their posture without and say, but that's got absolutely nothing to do with their policy platform, is a difficult position to sustain. If you want to promote greater racial equality in sport, why use the physical posture of an organisation that has all kinds of additional political
and is Marxist?
Objectives?
Openly Marxist.
And but also, I don't. It feels again like this sort of slightly Orwellian groupthink. I mean, it's possible that every single player in the Premier League
is a Marxist.
And supports Black Lives Matter, but it seems much more likely to me that they're not. And also, I don't. Mason Mount, Phil Foden, whatever, they're good players. I'm just not sure I look to them though for intellectual, moral, spiritual, political guidance. So you're going to Ollie Robinson, the cricket. You follow cricket less than football. But I was deeply troubled by that. I always thought
tweets from, just so for those who don't, tweets from sort of more than 10 years ago, wasn't it, or about 10 years ago?
Yeah, when he was a teenager, being slightly stupid. I mean, different people find different things stupid and annoying, but
or offensive.
But I thought the England cricket team was the best 11 cricket players from England. I didn't realise that you had to meet
certain ideological criteria
in order to play. And what's more, those ideological criteria aren't even contemporary. That if you had political views or social views when you're a teenager, you don't get to play for England. Well, I didn't realise this is, and I'm quite interested to know what the criteria, because I thought the criteria for playing cricket for England was
being good at cricket.
And what's more, not only does that no longer appear to be the dominant criteria, but there are different rules for different players. So some players who are deemed to be less dispensable are given more leeway. And and you get, I don't know, I mean, it seemed to me that we're getting a lot of encroachment. I admire South. I know we're not talking here about the football. I think creating togetherness in his squad. I mean, the case for Southgate, because it's contemporary, is that I think he has created a sense of mutual togetherness. Looks like it from the outside, which is hugely important in any group dynamic. You want the person who is keeping you out of the side to succeed, rather than to fail, so that you can get into the side in their place. And and it is noticeable, I think, that the England football team sing the national anthem with much more gusto than they used to. Yeah. So it is possible from the outside to think that
it's a sense of camaraderie.
Gareth Southgate is seeking to create a sense of camaraderie, which
it's a bit like the hacker from New Zealand
and embraces the strongly held views of all 26 members of his
and the
squad,
multiracial
and it's
nature
one
of
for
the
all,
team.
and it's one for all and all for one, and it's no more than that. And I think I'm guessing, I've never met him, I think he would probably say that and would think that we are over-interpreting it. But I do think that, given that the England football team is such embodies national unity to such an extent, it does seem strange to introduce a divisive
We've touched a lot on Brexit, a lot on culture and wokery and liberalism, but here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, although those are always issues that interest us, the fundamental institutions of a free society, I do want to touch on economic liberalism. Emma Revel, my colleague here, asked in the chat, former Lib Dem here, I left mid-coalition because the SDP-type grassroots couldn't or wouldn't accept the economically liberal victories we had in government. Do you think the Lib Dems will ever embrace the economic side of liberalism as well as the social side of liberalism? And perhaps I can underscore that by putting it in context, something you mentioned in your early remarks. I mean, the IEA feels like an increasingly lonely place in simply to say, you know, perhaps the state is a bit too large at the moment. Perhaps taxes are somewhat too high. Perhaps the government shouldn't control the commanding heights of the economy. Maybe there is a bit too much regulation. All of the political parties seem to be in the other direction. This is, I mean, some of the numbers to country with taxes over the, I mean, this requires a forecast, not a spot price, but taxes over the duration of this government, Boris Johnson's government elected December 2019, may well be higher, are likely to be higher as a proportion of national income than they were under Clem Attlee's socialist government after 1945. It's absolutely extraordinary. You highlighted basically we're at 100% of GDP on the on-balance sheet debt, let alone the public liabilities. Government, the last budget surplus was 2001, so we've got used to running small deficits in the good times and colossal deficits in the bad times. I don't think you need to be a kind of hardened Thatcherite or to sort of say, you know, hang on a minute, this is looking really rather dicey.
Left office, debt to GDP was only something like 30%, 35%.
And he was running, he ran a surplus in 2001.
He was notionally from the left as well.
So how has fiscal rectitude just gone out of the window? And it seems to me this is, I'm not just talking about the Liberal Democrats, all of the parties seem to be believing that in the magic money.
Going back to Emma's point, I did feel that, you know, the midpoint of the coalition was the point at which the Lib Dems gave up on being co-owners of the central propositions of the government and started to try and become the opposition within the government. And every time the government cut spending or made some necessary saving, the Lib Dems were always keen to say that was the Conservative part of the government. And every time the government decided to spend more money, the Lib Dems were keen to associate themselves with the growth of the state. So I think a fundamental observation is correct. Obviously, Corona, I mean, it's impossible to talk about the current situation without recognising the truly exceptional circumstance of coronavirus. But,
even I would accept government spending to show up in those circumstances.
You know, that is an obvious time to borrow large amounts of money, if not now, then when. But there isn't much of a sense that if and when we start coming out the other side, that we're all going to get a handle on this spending. And I think there's a case with very low, a strong case of very low interest rates for trying to upgrade a lot of our physical infrastructure, for example, which is fairly dilapidated. Some parts are still the Victorian infrastructure that were built, you know, 130, 140 years ago. But, you know, current expenditure on core areas of spending. Not only are they going up and should, I assume, continue to go up, but a great virtue is made of the fact they are going up. I mean, it's always like I thought David Cameron was always a bit confused because he used to argue that that it didn't matter how many police officers you had. What mattered was whether crime was falling, which it was under the time he was Prime Minister. But then you would simultaneously argue that
we're putting more bobbies on the beat,
or more nurses.
It
showed that he cared more about the NHS. We've got more nurses than even under Gordon. But now it's all inputs rather than outputs in the jargon across the board. So Boris Johnson's argument is we're going to have more police, we're going to have more doctors, we're going to have more nurses, we're going to have more. I don't know what we're not going to have more of. We're going to have more spending. We're going to have more infrastructure. I mean.
Well, we cut the foreign aid budget temporarily from 0.7 to 0.5. That's it, as far as I wrote an article for the Sunday Telegraph this past weekend. That was the only example I could find, and you can argue there's all sorts of argument about international development aid. Let's not get into those, but you would have thought that this was sort of enough to balance the books. This is a pinprick. I likened it in my article to this is a bit like phoning a plumber to come round and fix your dripping tap when your house is on fire. Right?
I mean, in terms of getting to grips with public finances, it's marginal, of course, but it's not. In other words, not just the budget; it's the mood music, and this is weirdly, this is our notionally centre-right party, and yet the criticism of Boris Johnson is what a grotesque right winger he is. Well, I'm waiting to see some evidence. In some of these threats to personal individual liberty, including in more trivial areas like what food you're instructed to eat or not, the government is at best a passenger and a bystander. Quite often it's joining in to try and coerce people down a certain path. And in economic terms, it's a tax and spend government. Not even the mood music is nothing like Blair and Browne in the run-up to the '97 election when they were keen to convince.
And again, what do you put that down to? I'm not asking you. Why is this the case? I mean, taking out the understandable colossal one-off hit of the past 15 months and not getting in so much too, but I might ask you in the minute some of the restrictions that have been in place. But okay, I'll take that. That's cost whatever, 300 billion we weren't expecting. But that is all on top of this spend freely. I mean, this period of austerity, I'm told about. When was that exactly? When was austerity is living within your means, not spending beyond them. And why? Why are we getting to this?
It's quite weird because when I was an MP, midday on a Wednesday, Prime Minister's Questions was such a sort of central feature in your sort of psychological diary, and I used to nearly always attend it. And it shows when you're no longer sort of living in the past, when you forget that Prime Minister's Questions is happening as an ex-MP. And so I listened to it on the radio while I was getting lunch ready a few weeks ago, having not listened to it for quite a long time or watched it. And what most struck me, apart from the style of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, was that the Prime Minister accepted a sort of statist left-wing premise of virtually every question. And that premise existed in some of the questions on his own side, not just the Labour. But however much the theatre, all the booing, so on and so forth, the underlying assumptions that
were all social democratic.
Were all social democratic, if not further left than that. And the Prime Minister, at no point that I can recall, actually challenged any of those underlying assumptions. His argument was, no, you're wrong. We are spending. We're spending even more money than you say. Or the reason we're not is because we're just having a review before we decide to spend more money than you say, or whatever it might be. But there was no sort of sense of intellectual pushback at all from the Prime Minister of the centre-right party. And I think that probably does communicate itself through government, that if you were to push back against some of those received notions, that you would be sticking your neck out.
And so what's your prescription, what's your advice to small L liberals of all stripes? How do we start marshalling the fight?
Donate to the IEA.
Well done.
Is that the correct?
Go to IEA.uk /donate. We'll put the IEA Patreon link in the chat as well. No, but obviously, I mean, we try to keep largely on the economic sphere, but not exclusively on economics. We, in addition to propounding the benefits of markets, we also support what we call the fundamental institutions of a free society. It seems to me over the COVID lockdown measures, which I think are a challenge for kind of libertarian-leaning people. I mean, it's not obvious that there shouldn't have been any restrictions on human freedom, but I think they've probably gone way too far, and the resistance has been fairly muted against them, right? I mean, we're now at the level of, I think, about what, sort of 5 or 10 people a day are dying at the moment, and there's still a debate about whether to keep restrictions in place.
An all holds bar libertarian. I mean, it seems to me that an infectious disease is
exactly the sort of thing where a classical liberal would accept state intervention.
Yes, and particularly in the early days, when we didn't really quite have a sense of what the magnitude of it was, and we didn't have a vaccine. I think you'd have to be a pretty far out sorry, that's a pejorative term, but I didn't take the view that that the restrictions were unreasonable. What I do think is that the goalposts have been moved a lot. We were told that the reason for this happening was that the NHS wasn't overwhelmed. People were not dying because of an absence of medical intervention, because there wasn't capacity to look after people who would otherwise be saved. And that is clearly not the case now, and hasn't been the case for a very long time. And yet, children are still being sent home who are perfectly healthy in their hundreds of thousands. And I think the case for that is very weak. There might be a case for it, but it's a completely different case than the case that was made 6 months ago or a year ago or 15 months ago. And it is notable that people are sort of, going along with different intrusions into their freedom, and it has become more normalised. It's been quite interesting in that way. Social experiment. I think people, whether you can just turn the switch on, and I think people will feel uncomfortable about commuting, uncomfortable with interacting with other people in large numbers, or at least a certain number of people will do.
For a while.
For a while. I mean, one assumes that large parts of life will get back to something like it was before, with some permanent changes due to accommodation of technology. But it will take a long time for it to for people to get over the psychological barrier.
So other than answering your primary response to the question, what to do to help Liberal donate to the IEA, I agree that
I don't know. I despair with Bruce. I felt that at the last general election, there was only really one big issue on the ballot paper, which was whether we were going to be able to get Brexit over the line. That our whole system was completely tied up by it. We were torturing ourselves as a country. We were humiliating ourselves internationally. And we needed to put into effect the result of a referendum that had taken place, whatever it was, three and a half years earlier. Preposterous that it had taken that long. In a way, it was in that way a slight another referendum. So Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party didn't really, I suppose, have to stand up in the court of public opinion and discuss economic policy. And in as much as they did, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party didn't offer an obvious tonic for people who are a bit more free market and a bit more in favour of responsible public spending. I hope that it will evolve back towards something closer to that. But to be honest, apart from the odd person who I approve of, some in government and some in other parts of politics, it's not quite the mute switch, but the volume has been turned right down on what I think are, I'm not even saying people who believe in a really small state. I'm just saying,
don't bankrupt the country.
Well, trying not to spend way beyond your means, trying to achieve value for money in public services, not assuming that there is an automatic correlation between spending more money and getting better outcomes. Seeing if we can make public services more efficient, whether we can deliver them better, whether we can make them closer to the individual end user. I don't hear any of this argument either. So I'm not saying it's just people who have a sort of slightly zealous appetite for whacking 20-30% of public spending. I just want people who attach some importance to spending, and to spending people's taxes. Like it's the money's their own and not somebody else's, and that they prize value for money. That would be a good start, and politicians who start doing that are worth listening to.
And let me just finish by asking you whether you think, whether it's politicians, think tanks, others in the media, do you think if that message was sensibly articulated, one of fiscal prudence, more role for individual discretion in people's lives, less role for state or perhaps even corporate mandated decisions, is that a popular rallying cry? Or have curmudgeonly liberals like you and I just got to get used to living in this rather dystopian, woke, increasingly socialist, and if we keep spending like this, heading for broke society?
Woke, broke, and revoked.
Yeah.
Even worse. I mean, I think there's a sweet spot. I think that there is a massive public appetite out there for, what you might say is the sort of zealous fringes of libertarianism? No, I don't. Slightly disappointingly, from my personal point of view, I think the public do quite like a degree of guidance, if not instruction. But I do think that there is a greater appetite than is currently served for governments that make more effort to live within their means, try and spend money more efficiently, try and get better value for money, and treat people like grown-ups and respect people and don't just talk down to them and lecture them, whether it's about their dietary preferences or what they think about people of different races than themselves. I think we have a sort of fundamental national attachment to a form of slightly subversive small L liberalism, which stands us quite well historically as a country. And if people of your persuasion don't overplay their hand, I think there is a pretty strong market for that. But it is, as I say, I don't think at the moment it's very obvious where that market is being served in politics, and I hope it will develop and expand, because at the moment, if we just have lots of people competing to demonstrate their virtue by spending money and associating themselves with identity politics, then I think
woke, broke, and revoke it is.
Well, I think that will be bleak. And get back to Brexit, I think we can make a success of the circumstances that we have collectively chosen as a country. I think we have many attributes in this country, and we can, and in many ways deserve to be successful if we apply ourselves. But there's no automaticity. We have to make good decisions, and I don't see enough critical mass of good decisions to give me as much confidence I'd like that in 10 or 20 years' time we will be, firing on all cylinders. So I hope there will be changes to the debate provoked by the IEA and others which will lead us in that direction.
Jeremy, on that slightly upbeat note, after a rather downbeat survey of the last 6 years of the political and economic scene, thank you very much for being our guest on the IEA's In Conversation event this evening. Always a pleasure to see you, sir. Keep in touch, and we look forward to inviting you back soon. Not only thanks to Jeremy, thanks for our viewers for watching. Thanks especially, as we mentioned earlier, to our IEA donors. If you are one, thank you very much. If you're not one and would consider throwing a few pennies our way, you can support IEA on the Patreon platform. Go to patreon.com/IEA London, or you can find information about that on our website. If you want to help us keep the lights on and produce this content, I can't charge you more than £150 a year, as I'm not the BBC, so I can only get it to you from you voluntary, not by force. Also, a couple of dates for your diary. Live with Littlewood, my weekly chat show, is back this Wednesday at 6 o'clock in the evening with another stellar lineup of guests to consider a free market look on the big issues of the week. And a date for your diaries. Our next In Conversation event is on the 2nd of August. I'll be hosting the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt, Paymaster General at the Treasury and author of a new book, Greater Britain After the Storm. Full details, again, available on the IEA website. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.